Joining us now, Senator Briggs Hopson represents District 23, which includes Issaquah, Warren, and Yazoo counties. Senator Hopson, of course, serves as the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Good to see you there, Senator.
Gerard, always great to see you. I wish I could be out there at the studio with you, but the circumstances of the Capitol dictate that I stay pretty close to the office here.
Understand. Appreciate you taking a little time to check in with us. So, of course, we're winding things down in the legislature. We've got conference weekend, as it is called, looming, and you guys are taking up the appropriations bills. Can you just explain to us, Senator, kind of the sequence of events, what we've been doing the last 2.5 months? Now we head into conference weekend, and then we start taking up these appropriations bills.
Well, generally, each side passes bills, and then they go to the other chamber, and then they have the opportunity to go through the whole process again, committee work, and then on to the other chamber. When you have disagreements between the two versions of the bill, then you end up going to conference to see if you can resolve those differences. That's kind of the short story. Now, as it relates to appropriations, you have every bill, every agency has a budget. And there are approximately 110 budgets that we deal with. And then you have some general bills, too, that are appropriations bills. But half of the budget bills start in the House, the other half start in the Senate. We swap them. Typically, they're going to go to conference every year. We try sometimes to get special funds out of the way early, but frankly, when you're not sure about some of the expenses, whether they're going to be operational considerations, whether they're going to be salary considerations, you kind of have to hold everything to the end until you got a real good feel about what your revenue estimate's going to be. You also know what spending level you want to be at. And some of the key projects. And so that's where we are right now. We've gotten to that point where you're talking about the differences between House and Senate measures and trying to work out the kinks.
Well, I know there's obviously a lot of work you can do, as you indicated, that the agencies are presenting their proposed budgets that, of course, figure into appropriations. But you've got some measures out there that could cost a whole bunch of money that you might have to consider as well, specifically potentially, I should say, the revised MAEP formula. That could figure into your appropriations process.
Yeah, I looked through the bills the other night, and between the Senate bills, MAEP being the biggest one on the Senate side, and then the House just had a lot of them stacked together that added up to close to the same dollar figure. You look at bills that have passed each chamber, and you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that are additional budget considerations. And so it's a good point you make, because people sometimes forget that is that what we do and what the chambers pass up here, if you end up passing those bills, you're going to build in money to the budget. So that's why we have to be careful about the things that we pass. And sometimes they just don't make it across the finish line. They'll pass on the first round. And I think the listeners should know this, and you know it well. Some of the things that pass the first round, when you get down to setting your budget, they don't make it across the finish line because there just aren't enough dollars, or there's just not enough joint momentum between the two chambers as to whether or not that should go forward.
I know something that you track, of course, diligently, serving as the appropriations chair in the Senate, is our revenue picture. How are we looking this year?
Revenue looks good. Talking about 23 revenue, which is the fiscal year in which we're presently considering, we're about $520 million over budget, and that's a good thing that we're doing well. Obviously, keeping an eye on things like inflation and keeping an eye on some of this stuff going on with the banks recently. Frankly, it's you don't want to be running around like Chicken Little, but you also need to be cognizant of what's happening in the overall economy as you start looking at what's going to happen for us in scheduling for 24. What's the state going to look like? What's the nation going to look like economically? Because you want to make sure you've got a smart spending picture for our state.
Historically, Senator, and you know this well, we're fairly stable, fairly consistent, I should say, in revenues. We don't really have these big spikes when maybe the macro economy is experiencing those. We don't really have these big drop-offs when the macro economy experiences those. And I think that's a function of just the economic ecosystem in our state. We're not reliant on one industry that's so subject to these ebbs and flows as some states are. So that's kind of a good, bad news sort of deal. But maybe it makes the process a little easier for you guys, you think?
Well, I do think that. I think we're, as you said, historically, you'll see Mississippi has not experienced the tougher times or the tougher cuts during recessions, but we've not experienced the highs that some states and nations even experience when you have significant growth. We've been more moderate in decline and moderate in growth, and that can be good. And, it's also frustrating when you're hitting the highs. You'd like to hit some of the real big highs. And I think the same, you mentioned, what do you look at? One thing that we have is a fairly balanced tax base. I know there were a lot of discussions last year and even this year about taxes too, but that we saw in other states during the COVID period and the recession that hit briefly after that, or the downturn in the economy, that some states that are reliant upon one or two forms of taxes can either do really well during certain times or really poorly in other times. And we're pretty balanced on our tax base in Mississippi, so that's keeps you from kind of hedge some of your concerns that you have about some sharp downturns or upticks.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I wanted to ask you about that I know you guys are well aware of. I've spoken to your colleague, Senator Harkins, about this on finance, but PERS. PERS is got a problem. You know it. PERS knows it. Everybody in that dome knows it. There are no easy solutions to this. Seems like we got to be taking some action pretty soon, though, don't we?
I 100% agree. And, there was a proposal this year which caused a lot of concern and angst, and for me too, that would have just raised, and this is something the listeners need to understand, that the proposal from the board, the PERS board, was to raise the employer contribution by 5%, from 17.4 to 22.4%. Keep in mind, that means that every agency is going to have to fund that portion of a retirement. And it's just a hard pill to swallow, a tough pill to swallow. That was $260 million roughly to the state, not to mention what it was going to hit for cities and counties and other forms of government that have to pay into retirement system. So that was the plan that they had. Now, whether there's an employer contribution increase later on or some change in the system, and I think that has got to be looked at. We can't keep kicking this can down the road. And we did to some degree, or they did to some degree this year, because they pulled that proposal off the table. But at some point, you're right. I mean, we got a tremendous unfunded liability, and unless something changes with the market, some actuarial examples would be good. I hope they'll look at that in detail. There may be a combination of things, maybe another tier, which means you'll bring in a separate set of standards for people that are coming onto the system later, not those that are in the system. But there could be some changes that have to be made, because, look, I think any retiree wants to know, they want to keep their retirement like it is. Anybody that's in the system, that's the current employee, wants to keep that retirement. It's one of the few things that a lot of people talk about having good in Mississippi as opposed to other states when it comes to pay. But we got to make sure the system's sound, or nobody will have retirement. And we've got to do what we need to do to correct that. And we hope that
Same
the PERS
situation.
board, we'll take that.
So, and let's,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Senator, please. Yeah, well, I was going to say that
the PERS board takes that into full consideration in making this decision. They want to keep the system sound and do the right thing for the state, and not cause a cut to the state budget, which could ultimately hurt the state overall. So that's some of the stuff they have to consider.
And I was just going to add to that, just a clarification, sorry to interrupt you, that the PERS board has the authority to increase the employer contribution. The legislature has the exclusive authority to increase the employee, the worker contribution, which stands now at 9.8%, seems to be the number that comes to mind. Is that right? Is it a little higher than that?
It's 9 and change. I think it was 9 and a quarter. We bumped it up, and again, tough decision to be made, but it was the right decision that we made about 10 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago, I'm guessing, that we made a decision to bump up the employee contribution and move back to what was originally a 30-year retirement period, and that had been shortened at one point when times were better. And that's, I think, a lesson for all of us, that sometimes when times are good doesn't mean you give up. You change your plan too much. You set a good plan and you work through it when times are bad and times are good. And usually it's going to end up in the long run being a lot better for you.
That's absolutely right. Well, Senator, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you some more as you guys dig more into the appropriations process. Good luck with all that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Gerard. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, sir. We're coming right back in the Element Wealth Studios.